Galen Voss sat alone in the quiet, dimly lit room of his secluded lunar home. The cold metal walls were lined with reminders of a past he tried to forget, trophies, medals, and old war reports scattered across his desk. Once a celebrated hero, now a shadow of his former self, Galen had retired from the battlefield years ago. His body was scarred from countless battles, but it was his mind that carried the heaviest burdens. He had fought wars to end wars, but the peace he sought always seemed elusive. The stars outside his window sparkled like tiny pinpricks of light, distant and unreachable. He thought of them often, those stars, as he drifted in his isolation. Life on the moon was quiet, uneventful. And that was how Galen preferred it. His days were spent tinkering with old tech, or lost in memories that had no place in the present. But tonight was different. The silence in the room was unsettling, as though something was wrong. Galen felt it in the air, a subtle shift, the way the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He'd been trained to sense danger, to notice the smallest details that most people would miss. His instincts, honed through years of combat, screamed at him to be alert. He stood up, stretching the stiffness from his tired body, and moved toward the door. As his hand touched the handle, the room's temperature dropped suddenly, and the faintest sound, like a whisper in the air, caught his attention. A shadow darted across the far wall, too quick for the eye to follow. Then, before he could react, a figure emerged from the darkness. Vyrexia was like no one he had ever seen before, a deadly assassin from the Tillari Dominion. She moved with the grace of a predator, her violet eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Her sleek black armor blended seamlessly with the shadows, a perfect match for the deadly calm that radiated from her. Her long black hair flowed like liquid midnight, and the razor-sharp edges of her combat blades reflected the dim light in a deadly dance. She was tall, with a lean, athletic build that spoke of countless hours spent honing her deadly craft. But what truly stood out were her eyes, those striking violet eyes that seemed to pierce through Galen's very soul. They weren't the eyes of a mindless killer. They held something else, something unsettling. Hesitation. For a brief moment, their gazes locked, and Galen saw something that didn't belong in an assassin's eyes. Doubt. Vyrexia was here to kill him. That was clear. Her mission was simple, her orders unambiguous. But as she stood before him, poised to strike, something in the depths of her gaze made her hesitate. Galen's heart raced, and his mind raced faster. He was no longer the young soldier who could fight with his eyes closed. He was older, wiser, and more attuned to the subtleties of human and alien behavior. She wasn't just a killer. She was more than that. But why was she here? What had changed? He had no time to dwell on it. With a burst of speed, he dove for the weapon beside his chair. But Vyrexia was faster. In an instant, her hand was on his throat, her grip unyielding, her strength undeniable. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. His vision blurred, but through the haze, he saw the conflict in her eyes. The tension in her hand softened, just for a fraction of a second, and in that moment, Galen realized something. She wasn't here to kill him. At least, not yet. Vyrexia had always been certain of her mission. Trained from childhood as an assassin in the Tillari Dominion, her mind was sharp, her reflexes faster than a human's ever could be. She had been bred for one purpose, to kill without hesitation. But now, standing in front of Galen Voss, her grip on her weapon faltered. She had the perfect chance to end him, to complete the mission she had been sent to carry out. But she didn't move. Why? For the first time in her life, Vyrexia didn't know what to do. Her violet eyes studied Galen's face, searching for any sign of weakness, any hint that he was the monster the Dominion had made him out to be. But instead, she saw something entirely different. She saw a man who had been through hell, someone who had fought and bled for the cause of peace, only to be forgotten by the very people he had tried to save. His face was hardened by years of battle, his skin scarred, yet his eyes told a different story, a story of regret, of loss, and of hope. Virexia's mind raced. She had studied the files about Galen, read every report on his past. He had been a hero during the Great War, leading human forces to victories that had changed the course of history. Yet, the very same hero had become a symbol of fear in the eyes of the Selari Dominion. They feared him not just because of his military prowess, but because of his ability to unite humans. They feared what he could do if he ever returned to power. So they had sent her to eliminate him before he could rise again. But here, now, in the quiet of his lunar home, Virexia saw something she hadn't expected. The man standing before her didn't look like a monster. He didn't look like the ruthless general who would destroy everything in his path to achieve his goals. He looked broken, tired, and despite everything, there was a kindness in his eyes, a glimmer of humanity that she hadn't anticipated. Virexia's hand tightened on her weapon, but only slightly. Her mission was clear. She had to kill him, or she would fail. The Dominion's punishment for failure was severe, and she knew the consequences all too well. Her entire existence had been built on following orders without question. But now, in front of Galen, the thought of carrying out that order felt wrong. She could still remember the reports from the final battle of the war. Galen had been on the battlefield, fighting against overwhelming odds. But it wasn't just his strength that made him stand out. It was the moment when he had spared the life of a young Silari soldier, her Virexia. She had been one of the many foot soldiers sent to fight against the humans. She had been trained to kill without thought, without remorse. But Galen had shown mercy. He had spared her life when he could have ended it without a second thought. It had been a small gesture, one that no one had ever noticed, but it had planted a seed in her mind that had grown over the years, a seed of doubt. Now, standing in front of him, Virexia couldn't help but wonder if he was truly the monster the Dominion had made him out to be. Was he the threat they believed him to be, or was he simply a man who had been caught in the web of war, trying to survive like everyone else? She took a step back, the weight of her mission pressing down on her. She had to decide. Could she kill the man who had shown her mercy all those years ago? Could she follow through with her orders, or would she let herself be swayed by something she didn't fully understand? The hesitation was deadly, but it was also a crack in her carefully constructed world, and it was a crack that, once opened, would never close. Galen's mind was racing. The moment stretched out, an unspoken tension hanging in the air between him and Virexia. He had barely processed what was happening before instinct took over. His hand shot out to grab the nearest object, a heavy metal rod from his workbench, but Virexia was faster. In an instant, she moved like a blur, closing the distance between them with terrifying precision. He barely had time to react before she was upon him, her hand tightening around his throat, forcing the breath from his lungs. Her grip was unyielding, her eyes cold and calculating, yet there was still that flicker of hesitation, something he couldn't quite place. For a second, Galen's vision went dark around the edges, his pulse thudding in his ears. He knew this wasn't just a fight for survival. This was something more. She was not just any assassin. She was someone who had been trained for this moment for years, and yet there was doubt in her eyes. That made her dangerous. The air crackled with the tension of a battle that neither of them had expected. Virexia's flawless reflexes were on full display as she expertly countered every move Galen made. But it wasn't enough to stop him. He wasn't the same soldier he had been, but his experience in combat had taught him something important. Never underestimate the human will to survive. With a burst of energy, Galen broke free of her grasp and shoved her back, putting distance between them. He didn't know what was happening between them, didn't know why she hadn't ended it already. But that wasn't important right now. What mattered was that he was alive, and he couldn't afford to let his guard down, not even for a second. Virexia's eyes flickered with something he couldn't read, surprise, maybe, or frustration. She had expected this to be quick, clean. Instead, Galen had fought back, and not only that, he had managed to land a hit. He wasn't just some target. He wasn't a helpless man waiting to die. No, he was still dangerous, still capable of putting up a fight. She lunged at him again, but this time, Galen was ready. He spun to the side, narrowly avoiding the sharp tip of her combat blade. He knew he couldn't win this fight through strength alone. Virexia was faster, stronger, and more skilled than he would ever be. His only advantage was his ability to think on his feet. He grabbed another piece of equipment from the desk, a wrench this time, and swung it toward her. Virexia dodged effortlessly, but just as she did, Galen's other hand reached out and grabbed her wrist, twisting it and forcing her to drop her weapon. The two of them struggled for control, but in the midst of their chaos, Galen saw it, the moment when her eyes softened, just for a second, the hesitation that had been there from the start. For that brief moment, everything slowed. Galen could see it clearly now. Virexia wasn't just trying to kill him. There was something else, something more complicated happening inside her. The question was, what was it? Was she still loyal to the Dominion, or was there something else at play? Before he could process his thoughts any further, Virexia twisted out of his grip and sprang back, landing in a defensive stance. Her chest rose and fell with rapid breaths, her eyes locked onto his. She didn't strike immediately, as though waiting for something. Galen knew she wasn't just trying to kill him anymore. She was testing him, gauging him. Galen took a deep breath and stood his ground. His mind was clear now, his body aching from the struggle, but he refused to back down. There was no telling what this was all leading to, but one thing was certain: neither of them was going to give up without a fight. The question was, what kind of fight would it be? A fight to the death, or something else entirely? The seconds stretched on, each one heavy with the weight of what had just happened. Galen and Virexia stood across from each other, their bodies tense, but neither of them moving to strike again. It was clear now that this wasn't just another fight. Something had changed in the air between them, a shift that neither could ignore. Virexia, the perfect assassin, the killer trained to eliminate threats without question, was staring at him as though seeing him for the first time. Galen's breath was still ragged from the fight, his muscles sore from the effort of holding his ground. He didn't know how much longer he could keep up this charade of resistance. His heart was pounding. But not just from the fight. There was something else, something in Virexia's eyes that told him she wasn't just here to kill him anymore. "I don't understand," Virexia said, her voice barely above a whisper, as though the words were a secret she had been keeping for too long. "Why didn't you kill me back then?" Galen frowned, his eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about?" His mind raced, trying to make sense of her words. "You remember the war," Virexia continued, her gaze softening. "The final battle. You?" She paused, her voice faltering slightly as though the memory was difficult to say aloud. "You spared my life." Galen blinked, confused. He had fought in hundreds of battles, countless skirmishes where the lines between friend and foe had blurred. But he couldn't recall the specific moment she was talking about. It had been chaos, a brutal conflict. How could he have spared her life? He had never left enemies alive unless there was a reason. Was she lying? Was this some kind of trick to get him off guard? Virexia could see the doubt in his eyes, and it only made her feel more conflicted. "I was just a soldier, one of many. I had been sent to kill you, and you could have easily done the same to me, but you didn't. You let me go. I never forgot it." A wave of recognition hit Galen. He remembered the battle now, the faces of the soldiers he had fought against, the heat of the conflict, and how, during a brief moment of silence amidst the chaos, he had locked eyes with one of the auxiliary soldiers, a young woman, no older than a recruit. She had looked at him, not with hatred or fear, but with something else. She had hesitated, and in that hesitation, he had made his choice. He'd spared her, not because he wanted to show mercy, but because he had seen something in her eyes, a reflection of his own struggle. That moment had been buried in his mind, tucked away as another one of the countless choices he had made during the war. But now, standing in front of him, Virexia's words brought it all rushing back. "You were that soldier," Galen murmured, realization sinking in. "I let you go." Virexia nodded, her expression softening. "I never forgot you, Galen. The Dominion. They don't care about mercy. They only care about power. But you showed me something different." Her voice shook, just slightly. "And now, I'm supposed to kill you." Galen felt a strange weight settle in his chest. He had made a choice long ago, one that he had thought meant little. But now, it seemed that choice had shaped this moment. It was clear to him now. Virexia wasn't just another assassin. She was a person caught between two worlds. And the reason she hadn't killed him wasn't because of some weakness. It was because of something deeper. "Why are you telling me this now?" Galen asked, his voice low, tinged with suspicion and curiosity. Virexia took a long, slow breath. "Because I can't do it. I can't kill you, not after what you did for me." The silence between them stretched longer than either of them was comfortable with. They were standing on the edge of something, both unsure whether to step forward or retreat. What was happening between them was complicated, messy, and dangerous. But one thing was certain. Virexia's mission had just become a lot more complicated than she had ever expected. Galen stared at Virexia, his mind reeling from her confession. It felt like the world had shifted on its axis. A simple choice, one that had seemed insignificant at the time, had changed everything. He had spared her life during the war, but he hadn't known then that this moment would come, that she would be standing in front of him, torn between duty and something else. The weight of that choice, of that moment, was heavier than he could have imagined. Virexia stood silently, her gaze not leaving his. She wasn't looking at him with the coldness of an assassin anymore. No, there was something different now. Something vulnerable. It was as if, in that moment of recognition, the walls she had built around herself had started to crumble. She had been a weapon, a tool for the Dominion's will, her purpose defined by others. But in that brief exchange of looks, when Galen had spared her life, she had seen something she hadn't expected. Compassion. And now, that compassion was weighing on her, pulling her in a direction she had never considered. What happens now? Virexia's voice was barely above a whisper, but it was full of the uncertainty she had been hiding for so long. Galen took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair. His thoughts were a whirlwind, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let this go. He couldn't let her stand there, torn between loyalty to an empire that didn't care for her and the truth that was unfolding between them. "I don't know what the Dominion wants from me," Galen said, his voice steady, but there was a sharpness to it. "I don't know what their plan is, but I do know this. They're not going to stop. They'll send someone else, someone worse than you." His gaze softened for a brief moment. "And if you don't make a choice now, they'll use you until there's nothing left of you." Virexia flinched as if his words had struck a chord deep within her. She had always known that the Dominion cared nothing for her. She had been a tool, nothing more. But hearing Galen say it so plainly was different. It made her question everything she had ever believed. "I didn't choose this," she said, her voice low, the weight of her words sinking in. "I never wanted to be an assassin. I wanted to be something else, something more." She paused, her hands trembling as she clenched them into fists. "But they trained me to be this. They made me into a weapon." Galen stepped closer, his voice quiet but firm. "It's not too late to change. You don't have to follow their orders. You don't have to be their weapon anymore." Virexia shook her head, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and confusion. "And what? Just walk away. After everything I've done, they'll come for me. They'll destroy me." Galen's expression hardened. Let them come. His eyes burned with a new resolve. "You don't owe them anything. They've used you, manipulated you. You can be free of that." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension was thick, like a storm that was about to break. Virexia was still struggling with the weight of her past. She had been trained to obey, to never question. And now, standing here with Galen, the very idea of freedom felt foreign. But a part of her, something deep inside, knew he was right. The Dominion had already taken everything from her. Her past, her innocence, her sense of purpose. Maybe it was time to take it back. I don't know how to start, she whispered, her voice barely audible. You start by making a choice, Galen replied. A choice for yourself. Virexia looked into his eyes, the hesitation still there, but no longer as strong as before. For the first time in years, she felt the pull of something other than duty, something that felt like hope. It wasn't an easy choice. It wasn't something she could decide in an instant. But as she stood there, facing Galen, she realized that the choice wasn't just about her. It was about what kind of person she wanted to be. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid to choose. The moment of silence stretched on, the weight of their conversation lingering in the air. Galen's words had planted a seed in Virexia's mind, and though doubt still clouded her thoughts, she knew there was no turning back. She had spent her entire life being a weapon, following orders without question. But now, with her heart racing and her mind spinning with possibilities, she realized that she had a chance to choose something different. But choosing freedom wasn't simple. The Dominion wouldn't just let her walk away. If they discovered her betrayal, there would be no mercy. The consequences would be swift and brutal. And yet, the thought of continuing to serve them felt suffocating. Every day had been a reminder that she was nothing more than a tool, a pawn in a game she had never signed up to play. Now, for the first time, she felt the stirrings of rebellion inside her. You're right, Virexia said softly, her voice steadier than before. But how do I escape? How do I leave all of this behind? Galen studied her, his expression serious. The first step is getting out of here. We can't stay on this moon for long. The Dominion has eyes everywhere. If they figure out you're here, they'll send a fleet to destroy this place. Virexia's mind began to race. They had to move quickly, and they had to be smart. She had spent years honing her skills, but this wasn't an ordinary mission. She wasn't just escaping from a single enemy. She was escaping from an entire empire. She glanced around the room, her sharp eyes scanning the walls. The equipment, everything in sight. There's a way out, she said, her voice more confident now. There's a hidden transport tunnel under this building. It's used for moving supplies in and out without being detected. It's our best chance. Galen raised an eyebrow, impressed. You know about it. Virexia nodded, her expression serious. I helped design it. I know every inch of this place, every hidden path. But we have to be careful. There are sensors along the way, and if we trip any of them, we'll be exposed. Galen didn't hesitate. Then we'll make sure we don't trigger any alarms. He glanced at her with a hint of a smile. Lead the way. Virexia's heart pounded as she stepped forward, her instincts kicking in. She led him down a narrow corridor, her footsteps light but purposeful. The silence between them was tense, both of them hyper-aware of every sound, every movement. They moved quickly but carefully, knowing that one mistake could cost them everything. As they approached the entrance to the transport tunnel, Virexia's mind was a blur of thoughts. She had never imagined she would be in this position, not just betraying the Dominion, but planning an escape with a man she had once been ordered to kill. But the more she thought about it, the clearer it became. Galen wasn't just a symbol of rebellion to her. He was a symbol of something she had long forgotten. Humanity's ability to change, to fight for something better. When they reached the entrance to the tunnel, Virexia hesitated. Once we're in there, there's no turning back, she warned. Galen's gaze was unwavering. Then we won't look back. With a final glance around, Virexia entered the tunnel, and Galen followed. They moved through the dark, twisting passages, each turn taking them farther from the place they had known. Virexia's mind was focused, her training coming to the forefront, as she navigated the maze of tunnels. Every now and then, she glanced at Galen, wondering what he was thinking. He hadn't shown fear, not even once. In fact, he seemed calm, steady even. It was as though, in this moment, he wasn't just escaping with her. He was with her, fighting for a future they both could believe in. The escape was risky, but the sense of freedom was intoxicating. For the first time in her life, Virexia felt like she was in control of her own fate. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about choosing to live, and to live on her own terms. The tunnel stretched endlessly before them, its dim lights flickering like stars in the vast emptiness. Virexia led the way, her every movement calculated, while Galen followed closely behind, his senses alert for any sound that could signal danger. The silence around them was deafening, and yet there was an unmistakable tension in the air. They were still deep within enemy territory, and every step they took brought them closer to freedom, and closer to the unknown. Virexia's heart raced, not from the physical strain of running, but from the weight of what they were about to do. She had spent so many years in the shadows of the Dominion, carrying out missions without question, and now she was defying everything she had been taught. For the first time, she was making her own choices, and the consequences were still unclear. As they rounded a corner, Virexia's sharp eyes caught a flicker of movement ahead. She immediately signaled for Galen to stop, her hand raised to indicate silence. Her instincts kicked in, her mind racing as she analyzed the situation. They weren't alone. A small squad of Dominion soldiers appeared in the distance, their weapons at the ready. They were moving fast, clearly on a mission. Virexia's pulse quickened. She knew the Dominion didn't give up easily, but she hadn't expected them to be so close. They must have detected something. Maybe a sensor had been triggered, or maybe they had already suspected her betrayal. Either way, they were here, and their presence meant one thing. The escape was over. Galen tensed behind her, but Virexia held up a hand, signaling him to stay quiet. She thought quickly, weighing their options. If they tried to fight their way through, they would be overwhelmed. But if they stayed hidden, they might have a chance to slip past unnoticed. "I know these tunnels," Virexia whispered, her voice low but steady. "There's an old maintenance hatch further down. If we can get to it, we'll be able to avoid them." Galen nodded. He trusted her, but there was no mistaking the seriousness of the situation. The Dominion soldiers were getting closer. They had no time to waste. Without another word, Virexia moved silently down the tunnel, her body pressed against the wall, blending into the shadows. Galen followed her closely, doing his best to stay as quiet as possible. The soldiers' footsteps echoed off the walls, growing louder with each passing second. Virexia's heart hammered in her chest. If they were caught now, there would be no escape. The squad rounded the corner just as Virexia and Galen ducked into a small alcove. Virexia's breath caught in her throat as she crouched low, her eyes fixed on the soldiers. They were only a few feet away, but they didn't seem to notice the pair hiding in the shadows. The seconds felt like hours, each one stretching as long as a lifetime. Then, just as the last soldier passed them, Virexia exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. They had made it. For now. The maintenance hatch was just ahead, its rusty metal doors barely visible in the gloom. Virexia reached for it, her hand trembling slightly as she turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing the small, cramped space beyond. It was the perfect hiding place. Galen followed her in, and they both breathed a sigh of relief as the door clicked shut behind them. The immediate danger had passed, but Virexia knew they weren't out of the woods yet. The Dominion would stop at nothing to track them down. They couldn't rest for long. "We have to keep moving," Virexia said, her voice steady, though the weight of the situation hung over her. "We're not safe here. Not yet." Galen nodded, determination in his eyes. "We'll make it," he said, his voice firm. "We have to." As they continued through the cramped, dark tunnels, Virexia couldn't help but feel a surge of hope. They had made it this far. The Dominion might have been right on their heels, but they had something the Empire didn't: a will to survive, and a bond that was growing stronger with every step they took. The tunnels twisted and turned like a labyrinth, each corner bringing them deeper into the heart of the unknown. Vyrexia led the way, her senses sharp, every step cautious. Galen followed, his eyes scanning their surroundings as they moved. Despite the silence between them, the tension was palpable, thick in the air. They both knew that the escape wasn't over yet. The Dominion would be relentless, and the shadows were never as safe as they seemed. Vyrexia felt her heart pound in her chest, the weight of their journey pressing down on her. She had always been a lone wolf, trained to trust no one, to rely only on her skills. But now, with Galen by her side, the world seemed different. She had never thought she could rely on someone else, never believed that anyone could see her for more than what she had been trained to be. Yet with each passing moment, that belief was slowly beginning to change. Galen caught up to her, his voice a low whisper. How much farther? Vyrexia hesitated, her mind calculating. Not much. There's a safe house just ahead, hidden deep in the tunnels. We'll be safe there, at least for a while. They pressed on, their footsteps quiet against the cold metal floors. But as they neared the safe house, Vyrexia's gut twisted. Something didn't feel right. She slowed, motioning for Galen to do the same. What is it? Galen asked, his voice tense. Vyrexia's eyes narrowed. I don't know, but I feel like we're being washed. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Every shadow seemed to shift, every sound amplified in the eerie stillness of the tunnels. She had been trained to trust her instincts, and right now, her instincts were screaming that something was wrong. Suddenly, a loud clang echoed through the tunnel. Vyrexia froze, her heart leaping in her chest. The sound was unmistakable. It was the unmistakable signal of an ambush. Before she could react, a figure stepped out from the shadows, blocking their path. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing the insignia of the Dominion. His face was cold, but there was something familiar about his posture, something that sent a chill down Vyrexia's spine. Vyrexia, the man said, his voice low and steady. I've been looking for you. Galen's hand instinctively went to his weapon, but Vyrexia held up a hand to stop him. She knew this man, or at least she used to. His name was Galen, and he had been one of her closest comrades during her time with the Dominion. They had fought side by side, trusted each other with their lives. But now, with his cold eyes fixed on her, she could feel the weight of betrayal hanging in the air. What do you want, Galen? Vyrexia asked, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. Galen's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. I want what's best for you, Vyrexia. The Dominion has its plans for you. You've always been a valuable asset. Don't throw that away. Vyrexia felt a wave of disgust wash over her. She had always known that the Dominion saw her as nothing more than a tool, but hearing it from Galen's mouth made it feel real. She could feel the weight of his words like a trap, tightening around her with every passing second. You're lying to yourself, Vyrexia said, her voice sharp. You're here to stop me. Galen's smile faded, his expression hardening. I'm here to bring you back. You know as well as I do that the Dominion doesn't let its best agents walk away. They don't forgive. Galen stepped forward, his eyes burning with determination. She's not going back to them. You can try to stop us, but it won't work. Galen's gaze flicked to Galen for the first time, a cold calculation in his eyes. You think you can protect her. You don't understand what you're dealing with. Vyrexia's mind raced. She could feel the walls closing in. This was it. Galen had been sent to bring her back, and he wouldn't stop until he succeeded. But Vyrexia wasn't going to let that happen, not after everything she had been through. I'm not going back, Vyrexia said, her voice strong. And neither is he. Galen's eyes darkened. Then you've made your choice. The air between them thickened, the tension so palpable that it almost felt like the world was holding its breath. The battle lines were drawn, and as Virexia stood there, her heart pounding, she knew one thing for sure. This was no longer about survival. It was about fighting for a future that she had only just begun to believe in. Virexia's heart raced as she stared at Kalen, the once friend who had become her enemy. His eyes were cold, calculating, and she knew without a doubt that he wouldn't hesitate to carry out the Dominion's orders. She had fought beside him in countless missions, trusted him with her life, but now that trust felt like a distant memory, shattered by the truth of what he was willing to do. Galen stood beside her, his posture tense, ready for whatever was coming. He had always been the kind of man who fought for what he believed in, no matter the cost. And now, as they faced Kalen, she realized that they weren't just fighting for their lives. They were fighting for their freedom, for a chance to live without the weight of the Dominion hanging over them. "We don't have to do this, Kalen," Virexia said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "You know it's wrong. They've used you. They've used us both." Kalen's gaze hardened, and he took a step forward. "You don't understand. The Dominion gave us purpose. They gave us strength. And now you want to throw it all away." "No," Virexia replied, her voice fierce. "I'm choosing something more than that. I'm choosing to live for myself, not as a tool for an empire that doesn't care about me." Galen's hand tightened around the hilt of his weapon, but he didn't move. He was waiting, watching, and Virexia could feel the tension building between them and Kalen. It was as if the entire tunnel held its breath, waiting for the first spark to ignite the battle that was about to unfold. Kalen's lips curled into a twisted smile, and he drew his own weapon, the cold steel glinting in the dim light. "Then you're choosing to die," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You both are." Virexia felt a rush of adrenaline as Kalen lunged forward, his weapon aimed straight for her. Without thinking, she ducked, rolling to the side just in time to avoid the strike. Her instincts took over, the years of training and experience kicking in as she flipped back onto her feet. She was fast, faster than Kalen expected, and for a brief moment she saw the surprise in his eyes. But that moment was fleeting, and before she could react, Kalen was already advancing again, his movements swift and calculated. Galen stepped in, blocking Kalen's path and forcing him to pause. "Virexia, move," he shouted. Virexia didn't need to be told twice. She dashed to the side, her body moving with fluid grace as she avoided another strike from Kalen. Her mind was sharp, her heart pounding in her chest, but she kept her focus. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for the future, for everything she had come to believe in over the past days. She wasn't going to let Kalen or the Dominion take that away from her. Kalen, realizing that he couldn't outmatch them both, sneered. "You think you can escape this? The Dominion will hunt you down, no matter where you go." "Let them," Virexia said, her voice filled with defiance. "We're not afraid anymore." With a sudden burst of speed, Virexia launched herself at Kalen, using her training to disarm him and send his weapon flying across the floor. He stumbled back, his eyes wide with disbelief. Galen was already at her side, his expression determined. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, Virexia felt the edge of victory in her grasp. Kalen backed away, his chest heaving with frustration and anger. "You can't win," he spat. "You'll never outrun the Dominion." Virexia stepped forward, standing tall and unyielding. "Maybe not," she said, her voice steady, "but we don't have to. All we need is the strength to fight for what's ours. And that's something the Dominion can never take." In that moment, everything seemed to fall into place. Virexia had chosen her path, and she knew that she wasn't alone. Galen was with her, and together, they could face anything. The Dominion might still be out there, hunting them, but they would fight every step of the way. They would no longer be tools of the Empire. They would be free. With a final look at Kalen, Virexia turned and grabbed Galen's hand. "Let's go," she said, her voice filled with quiet strength. As they ran, the sound of Kalen's curses faded into the distance, but Phyrexia didn't look back. The road ahead was uncertain, and danger still lurked around every corner, but she had made her choice. She would no longer be a pawn in someone else's game. She would live on her own terms. And for the first time in a long while, she felt free.